I showed up 3 hours early at the airport to surprise my husband before his business conference. Near the security checkpoint, in the same public area where every traveler says their goodbyes before heading through, I saw him standing with my younger sister. As they pulled apart, he said, "By Friday, she'll be homeless and alone, and she'll never know it was us." My sister smiled and whispered, "She'll thank us for leaving before she finds out the rest." I turned around, walked back to my car, and made a decision that would end both of their lives as they knew it, without either of them seeing it coming until it was already over. My name is Avalon Sterling. I was 34 years old, married for 7 years to a man named Grant, and for exactly 40 seconds in that airport terminal, I stopped breathing. Then I started thinking. And thinking, it turns out, was the only weapon I ever needed. Let me back up, because you need to understand what I stood to lose that day and what I was about to take back. Grant and I met at a mutual friend's wedding when I was 26, standing near the cocktail table because I didn't know anyone and he'd noticed me standing alone. He was charming in that easy, practiced way, the kind of charm that made waitresses laugh and made my mother adore him before she'd even learned his last name. He worked in commercial real estate finance, moving numbers around for developers, closing deals other people were too nervous to close. He was good at it, good enough that by the time we married, we bought a beautiful 4-bedroom house outside Charlotte, the kind with a wraparound porch and a magnolia tree in the front yard that I'd planted myself the spring we moved in, because I wanted something in that yard that was mine from the very beginning. I taught 8th grade English at a public middle school. Not glamorous, not high-paying, but it was mine, and I loved it. The mess of teenagers finding their voices, the parent conferences, the quiet satisfaction of watching a kid who hated reading fall in love with a book by the end of a semester. Grant used to tease me about my little job, always with a smile, always framed as affection. "You could do so much more, but I love that you're happy with less." I didn't clock, back then, how often his jokes had a blade folded inside the softness. I thought marriage meant you let the small comments go, because the big things, the loyalty, the partnership were solid. My younger sister, Marisol, was 29 and had always lived a half step behind me in a way that used to make me protective of her and, if I'm honest, made her resentful of me in ways neither of us said out loud. She was smarter than people gave her credit for, prettier in the conventional sense, and endlessly unsatisfied. 3 failed business ventures, 2 broken engagements, a rotating cast of apartments she could never quite afford on her own. Our parents helped her more than they ever helped me, and I never said anything, because that's what you do for family. You absorb the unfairness quietly and call it love. Marisol had been staying with us for 4 months by then. She said she was between opportunities, which was a phrase she'd used for most of her adult life. Grant said it was fine, that family takes care of family, and I believed him, because why wouldn't I? I made up the guest room myself. I bought her favorite cereal at the grocery store without being asked. I introduced her to my book club friends like I was proud of her, because in some complicated way I was. I didn't know that the house Marisol was sleeping in wasn't just a house to them anymore. It was an asset, and I was the only obstacle standing between them and it. 3 weeks before the airport, Grant told me he had a finance conference in Atlanta, Wednesday through Saturday. He'd been going to these twice a year for as long as we'd been married, so nothing about the trip itself struck me as unusual. What was unusual, in hindsight, was how many small, strange details had been accumulating around it. He asked me twice, almost in passing, not to worry about the paperwork if anything came in the mail addressed to both of us. He mentioned, casually, over dinner, that he'd updated our estate documents just to simplify things, and when I asked what that meant exactly, he waved a hand and said it was boring, that he'd walk me through it when he had more time. Marisol had started taking phone calls in the backyard those same weeks, pacing near the fence line, her voice dropping the moment she noticed me near a window. I noticed all of it. I've always been the kind of person who notices things. It's half of what makes me good at my job, catching the kid in the back row who's quietly falling behind before anyone else sees it. I noticed the phone calls. I noticed the offhand comments about paperwork. I just didn't yet know what I was looking at, because I had no framework for suspecting the 2 people I trusted most in the world. The Tuesday before his flight, I decided to surprise him. It wasn't complicated. I'd wrapped up a grading project early, I had a rare day off, and I thought, wouldn't it be sweet to drive him to the airport myself, buy him a coffee, send him off properly instead of our usual rushed morning goodbye. I told no one. I wanted it to be a surprise. I got to the airport 3 hours early, thinking I'd catch him near the check-in counters. Instead, in the open concourse just before the security checkpoint, the last public spot where anyone without a boarding pass can stand, where every family says their final goodbyes before the line splits travelers from everyone else. I saw him already there, and standing across from him, close enough that their foreheads nearly touched, was my sister. For one merciful second, I told myself I was misreading the distance between two bodies. Then Grant leaned in and kissed her, unhurried, in the specific, familiar way you kiss someone you've kissed 100 times before, not the way you kiss someone by accident, or once or out of confusion. I didn't move. I didn't gasp. Something in me went very still and very cold, the way water goes still right before it freezes solid. As they separated, Grant said the words that would replay in my head for the rest of my life. By Friday, she'll be homeless and alone, and she'll never know it was us. Marisol smiled, my sister smiled, and said, "She'll thank us for leaving before she finds out the rest." The rest. There was more. There was a rest still coming. I turned and walked back through the terminal, past the coffee stand where I'd planned to buy his usual order, out into the parking garage, and sat in my car for 11 minutes without turning the key. What came first was a question, cold and clear as glass. What exactly is happening to me by Friday? I had 3 days to find out. I intended to use every hour of them. I drove home instead of to school, called in sick for the first time in 4 years, and sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad, the way I imagined a detective might, except the crime scene was my own marriage, and the suspects had been eating dinner across from me for months. The word, homeless, kept circling. Homeless meant the house. There was only one way Grant could make me homeless by Friday without my knowledge, something involving the house's ownership, or its mortgage, or a document carrying my name that I'd never actually agreed to. I started with the locked drawer in his home office, the one I'd never questioned in 7 years because trust, I was learning, is just a locked drawer you never bother to open. I found the spare key tape beneath the desk because Grant was clever about people but careless about hiding places. Inside were refinancing documents from a title company I didn't recognize, dated 3 weeks earlier, proposing to refinance our home under a new loan, pulling out nearly all our built-up equity, almost $200,000, redirected to a newly opened account. My signature sat on the intake form. I had never signed it. I sat with that for a long moment before I found the second document underneath it, a quitclaim deed, prepared and notarized, transferring my entire ownership interest in the house to Grant alone. Notarized on a date I could account for precisely. I'd been at a parent-teacher conference that evening from 6 to 9, which meant whoever signed in front of that notary had never once been me. I called my cousin Denise, a real estate attorney of 9 years, before I did anything else, and told her everything, start to finish, without softening it. She listened without interrupting, which is rare for her, and when I finished, she said one sentence that steadied me more than anything else could have. "Avalon, if that signature isn't yours, there'll be a paper trail proving it, and we go get that trail before we do anything else." She was right. Notary offices in our state are required to keep a signed journal for every transaction, a log with the date, the type of document, a copy of the ID presented, and a right thumbprint beside the entry. Denise had a former colleague send a records request to the notary's office that same afternoon, citing the fraud dispute. What came back by evening was exactly what we needed. A journal entry from that date, an ID copy attached to it, and a thumbprint, none of which were mine. The ID photocopy showed my full legal name typed above a photo that was unmistakably Marisol's face. The notary's own office camera, which recorded every desk transaction as a standard fraud precaution, still had the footage on file from 3 weeks back. It showed my sister sitting in that chair. That was the moment the cold, clear feeling in my chest sharpened into something else entirely. My own sister had sat in front of a camera and a fingerprint pad and pretended to be me. Denise walked me through the shape of what came next. The refinance was scheduled to close Friday, 3 days out, which meant the funds hadn't moved yet. If I acted before Friday, I could stop the transaction entirely. If I waited even a day too long, I'd spend months fighting to get money back instead of simply refusing to let it leave in the first place. That afternoon, I did 3 things. First, I called the lender directly, identified myself, explained I'd never consented to this refinance, and formally disputed it, requesting an immediate hold pending fraud review. Second, I called our joint bank and flagged both accounts for suspicious activity, adding a temporary security hold requiring both signatures, in person, for any transfer above a modest threshold. Third, Denise's idea. I asked her to draft an emergency motion I could file the moment I had complete documentation, so that if either of them tried anything else, any other account, any other asset, I'd already have legal standing to move fast. That evening, needing air, I drove to my friend Callie's place 2 streets over, someone I'd known since college and trusted completely, and told her everything in her kitchen while she made tea neither of us drank. She didn't say the things people usually say. Are you sure? Maybe there's an explanation, because she knew me well enough to know I wouldn't have come to her with half a story. Instead, she asked, "What do you need from me?" I told her I needed someone to sit with me while I read through everything one more time, so I wasn't doing it alone, and she said yes before I finished the sentence. That night, Grant called from his hotel in Atlanta, voice warm and ordinary, asking how my day had been. I said, "Fine, quiet," and I meant it in a way he couldn't possibly understand. Denise had been clear. The advantage I had was that they still believed I was asleep inside my own life. The second I confronted them, that advantage disappeared. So I stayed asleep on the surface, while underneath I was already awake and moving. The next morning, I went looking for the rest. The part Marisol had mentioned at the airport, the part implying there was more coming than the house alone. I found it on our shared home computer, where Grant had forgotten to log out of his personal email. It wasn't only about money. It was about my name, and the story they intended to tell about it afterward. Grant had filed paperwork with his employer's benefits office changing the beneficiary on his life insurance policy. My name replaced with hers, a policy valued at $400,000, processed 2 weeks earlier. And in the same folder sat a half-finished, unsent letter addressed to my parents, drafted in Grant's voice, explaining that I'd been secretly struggling, that I'd grown unstable and withdrawn, that he was worried about my mental health and wanted them to be gentle with me if I said anything confusing in the weeks ahead. That was the whole architecture of the plan laid bare. Drain the house, redirect the insurance, and preemptively poison the well with my own parents, so that if I ever pieced it together and tried to tell someone, I'd already be cast as a fragile, unreliable one nobody should believe over him. She'll never know it was us, because by the time I noticed anything was wrong, I'd have no house, no claim on his assets, and a family already primed to doubt me instead of him. I sat with that letter longer than I sat with anything else that week, quiet, and far more resolved than shaken by that point. I thought about every dinner Marisol had eaten at our table over 4 months, every time she'd hugged me and called me the older sister who'd always looked out for her. I thought about 7 years of birthdays, 7 years of Grant's hand resting on the small of my back at other people's parties, 7 years of believing the story he told about who we were together. Then I picked up the phone and called Denise again. "I need everything documented," I said. "Every single piece. And I need to know exactly how fast we can move. Here's what most people don't understand about being betrayed by 2 people who think they're smarter than you. Their entire plan depends on you staying exactly where they left you." So I let them believe that's where I was. Wednesday and Thursday, I went to work as usual. I smiled at Marisol over coffee. I sent Grant a text wishing him luck at his keynote. Meanwhile, Denise and I built the case with a speed that surprised even her. The lender's fraud department confirmed the refinance had been placed on full hold pending investigation, citing the forged signature and the mismatched ID on file, which meant the $200,000 was never going anywhere. The bank confirmed the account freeze was active. Denise filed an emergency petition disputing the quitclaim deed, attaching the notary journal entry, the ID copy, and the office camera footage, evidence that took less than a day to confirm what I already knew. Thursday evening, I drove to the county recorder's office and filed a formal notice of forged instrument against the property record, a public flag meaning that even if Grant tried to rush anything through before Friday, any title company doing basic due diligence would see the dispute immediately. Denise called it throwing sand in every gear at once. It worked exactly like that. Friday morning, Grant flew home a day earlier than his own itinerary said he would, which told me everything. He intended to be present in person when the refinance closed, likely to keep Marisol from losing her nerve, or to make sure I hadn't stumbled onto anything before the money moved. He walked in around 11, dropped his bag by the door, and called out for me like nothing in the world was wrong. I was sitting at the kitchen table. Marisol was already there. She'd been staying with us, after all, and clearly hadn't planned to be anywhere else that morning. I had the folder in front of me. Denise was on the phone in the next room, listening, ready to advise if I needed her. "We need to talk," I said, and slid the folder across the table. I watched Grant's face do something I'd never seen it do in 7 years of marriage, go completely blank, the practiced charm falling away because there was nothing behind it built for this particular moment. Marisol's hand went to her mouth. "The refinance is frozen," I said. "The deed is flagged as forged with the county. The bank accounts are locked. And I have the notary's camera footage of my sister sitting in that chair with my name on the paperwork." Grant tried, for about 90 seconds, to talk his way into the room the way he talked his way into every room for his entire adult life. "Avalon, you're misunderstanding. Let me explain. This isn't what it looks like. But there is no version of my wife's forged signature on a deed she never signed that becomes something other than exactly what it looks like." I let him run out of words on his own. It didn't take long. "I heard you at the airport," I said finally. "Both of you. By Friday, she'll be homeless and alone." I heard every word. Marisol started crying, the kind of crying that's really just panic wearing a softer face. She said she never wanted any of this, that Grant had convinced her, that she felt trapped between loving her sister and being tired of watching me have a life she felt she'd never get for herself. Being tired of your sister's life is not a reason to forge her name on a deed to take her house out from under her, and I told her exactly that. I told them calmly what came next. The forged deed and the fraudulent refinance attempt would both be referred to the district attorney's financial crimes unit with full documentation. The life insurance beneficiary change would be formally contested through Grant's employer, given the fraudulent circumstances surrounding it. I would be filing for divorce that week, and given the documented fraud, I intended to pursue full ownership of the house along with a significant accounting of anything he'd moved or hidden during our marriage. And Marisol needed to be out of my home by the end of the day. Grant tried anger next. When charm failed him, raised voice, accusations that I was overreacting, that this would ruin his career if it became public. I told him that should have occurred to him before he asked my own sister to sit in front of a camera and forge my name. He lost his position at the firm within 2 months. Once the fraud referral triggered a licensing review, the kind of professional consequence that follows a person permanently in that industry. The insurance beneficiary change was reversed once the fraudulent circumstances were confirmed with his employer. The divorce, given the documented forgery, moved through the courts faster than even Denise had predicted, and I kept the house outright, along with a settlement that accounted for what he'd attempted to take from me. Marisol moved back in with our parents, who did not, in the end, ever receive that letter about my instability, because I made sure they heard the true story from me first, in my own voice, before anyone else got the chance to shape it for them. My parents were quiet for a long time after I told them everything, sitting at their own kitchen table with the same documents spread in front of them that had once sat in front of me. My mother's eyes filled, though she didn't let the tears fall. My father asked, more than once, whether I was certain, not because he doubted me, but because certainty like that is hard for a parent to hold. By the end of that conversation, they understood exactly who had lied and who hadn't. Marisol tried, twice, to reach out to me in the months that followed, once by text, once by a letter she left in my mailbox without a return address. I didn't answer either one. Some bridges you don't burn out of anger. You let them burn out of consequence, because that's the fairest thing you can do for everyone involved, including yourself. I still planted flowers under the magnolia tree that spring. Alone, but not the way Grant had planned it. Alone the way you are when a house is finally, entirely, undeniably your own. I used to think betrayal was loud. A slammed door, a shouting match, a scene you could point to and say, that's when everything broke. I learned instead that the worst betrayals are quiet. They happen in locked drawers and notary journals, and letters written in your own husband's hand about a struggle you never actually had. The people plotting against you don't always look like villains. Sometimes they look like the man who kisses you goodnight, and the sister who calls you when she's lonely. But I also learned this. The same quiet that lets people plot against you is the same quiet you can use to stop them. I didn't need to scream in that airport to win. I needed 3 days, 1 folder, and the discipline to let 2 people believe, right up until the very last moment, that I still didn't know a thing. By Friday, I wasn't the one who was homeless and alone. So tell me, if you found out the 2 people closest to you had been planning your downfall behind your back, would you confront them the second you found out? Or would you do what I did, and let them walk straight into the trap of their own making?